Here to talk to us about that impact is Jessica Brand, a lawyer and executive director of Wren Collective, a nonprofit focused on criminal justice reform and prosecutorial power. Jessica Brand, welcome to What a Day.
Thanks for having me, Josie. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. President Trump sent the National Guard into D.C. a few weeks ago now, and they have ratcheted up arrests, but at least twice prosecutors have been unable to even secure indictments in some high-profile cases. So, for example, after a former DOJ employee allegedly threw a sandwich at an officer, prosecutors tried to charge him with multiple felonies, but the grand jury refused to indict. Not a ton of failure to indict, but at least a couple notable ones. What does that tell us about DOJ prosecutors right now and their priorities?
Well, they're taking orders from up high, and the orders are charge things as harshly as you can. And that's not normally how it works, right? Normally you take a case, you look at the evidence, and you decide, okay, what's the appropriate charge that I can actually prove, right? That makes a lot of sense. That's not what's happening right now. It's, okay, this could possibly meet some really harsh, terrible standard, and so we're going to charge it as such. But you actually have to have evidence of proof. They're not making it, and juries are rejecting it. So I think it tells you they're overcharging a lot of these cases.
So given the presence of the National Guard and this ongoing presence of ICE and this increase in federal police presence, how is that affecting DC residents? And what is the long-term impact of an increase in law enforcement like this?
Well, I think it's huge, and I'll put it in a couple of buckets. One is just the long-term impact of people who are living on there, right? So you can see that businesses are really being impacted because who wants to go out to dinner and go to the monuments when there's armed guards all of a sudden in your street, right? That's not what anybody wants. And you can see there's the stories about reservations going down. There's also the story about people not wanting to go to work, right? Or immigrants not wanting to be Uber drivers or not wanting to do their jobs and bring food delivery service, right? It's just shutting that whole thing down because people are terrorized. And it's not, of course, improving the places where there's actually crime. That's not, the National Guard is out putting mulch on the mall. They're not actually policing places where there are high crime hotspots. And for good reason. They actually don't know how to do that. That's not what they do for a living. They wouldn't be very good at that. So there's sort of aspect number one is people are not really living their lives in the same way. And then there's sort of aspect number two, which is what's happening in the court system, but it's actually bringing the court system to a standstill. Because it's not like all of a sudden police and the National Guard and the FBI are solving a bunch of unsolved murder cases or really serious crimes. What's coming in is their misdemeanors, right? And often they're misdemeanors that are happening because there's increased interaction with the new law enforcement on the ground. So they're like a whole bunch of misdemeanors that wouldn't exist but for the presence of new law enforcement there. Mm-hmm. But then you need lawyers, you need judges, and you need grand juries if they're being charged federally. These cases are almost never charged federally. Now suddenly they are. And so it's sort of bringing the legal system to a standstill and straining it beyond all comprehension and all resources that exist in Washington, D.C. So life is going poorly for a lot of people who live there. And then the legal system is really at a breaking point.
We keep hearing that ICE officers have been working in tandem with D.C. police, as well as federal officers like the National Guard. And we've seen immigration officers at car checkpoints, for example. What does it mean for D.C. residents? And what does it mean for all of us to have ICE kind of working with local police like this?
I think the scale is for sure new. I mean, this, Josie. ICE for a really long time has worked very closely with sheriff's departments, which in a lot of the country, especially the South, is a big part of traditional law enforcement. The sheriff handles a lot of arrests and stops. And like in Texas, we have a law where there has to be cooperation, at least in the jail. But a lot of sheriff's departments also cooperate with ICE in making arrests, but not on this scale. What does it mean? Well, one, you presumably want your police department really focused on solving street crime, right? Solving murders, which traditionally go unsolved in this country, solving sexual assaults, right? They're not doing that. They're just pulling over people now willy-nilly and making arrests and putting them into ICE custody. So they're not actually doing the investigative work that police departments are supposed to do. So that is actually a public safety issue. But the second thing is, look, people don't, especially in cities, they don't like these policies. They don't like what's happening with ICE right now. They don't like that they're daycare providers and their nurses and their teachers are getting separated from their families and put into immigration custody. And so when you see that actually that's what your police department is doing, that's a huge breach of trust between a department that's supposed to work on behalf of you and keep you safe and the community that they're supposed to represent. And so that is just a tremendous problem. And I'd say the third thing is, if you are an undocumented person and you are a victim of a crime, you are now a sitting duck, because you cannot call the police department to protect you, because you know they are cooperating with ICE. And so you know that you're going to end up in ICE custody. So if you were robbed or you were harmed or anything bad happens to you, you have no recourse at all right now with this cooperation.
So let's talk about what's happening outside of DC. So the president has talked about sending National Guard troops to all these other places, including Chicago. He's been talking about purportedly cracking down on crimes in Chicago. Do you predict that we will see what we're seeing in DC happen in Chicago and other places?
I mean, he has a lot more control over what happens in DC because DC's, it has home rule, but home rule is really limited. So obviously he has way more autonomy over what happens in the District of Columbia than if he does and he goes into, for example, Chicago. But, we saw him do it in LA. And obviously, I'm not a crystal ball reader for this president, but I think if you assume, as I do, that this is not about public safety, but about taking over Black and brown cities and places that don't vote for the president and creating a climate of fear and desensitizing to people to military force so you can grab power, then it can't stop with Washington, D.C., right? It's going to happen in other cities. And it's also a president who actually does like to follow through on a lot of his threats. And so I think we should expect the worst.
Yeah, something you just said is what I was going to kind of talk about next, which is how much of this do you think is actually an attempt to address the problem and how much of it is politics?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to start with the premise that crime is real and serious in a lot of communities. And, John Rich is a doctor who has studied trauma in Black and brown communities and violence. And in his book, Wrong Place, Wrong Time, he says, the problem with people saying like crime is up, crime is down, crime trends is in a lot of communities, it's stagnant, right? You may see a reduction in carjackings, and that's wonderful, but there's still too much violence in certain communities. And I think we all need to accept that and then think like rational people and figure out how to stop that instead of making those communities political volleyballs, which is what they really are. And if you wanted to actually address what is a very real problem, we know what you would do because there's like a lot of research on this, right? You would have hospital-based programs that treat trauma. You would put credible messengers, but also just doctors and healthcare providers and trauma counselors and with really high-risk kids and high-risk communities to help them so that you don't end up with the serious violence that often explodes from untreated trauma. And yes, you would also have better schools and sort of the like bigger picture things, but there are immediate interventions that you could do right now. He's cut all the funding for it, right? It's gone. The DC budget is gone. The DOJ grants are gone. The substance use treatment money is gone. It's all gone. We know what you would do, and he's not doing it at all. He's actually making it incredibly worse. And that is really, it's a scary thing for all of us because it means a power grab, but it's also really sad because there's people who really relied on those programs and their lives depend on them.
Jessica Brand, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Josie Duffy-Rice.